Staff Sergeant Rebecca Martinez had always been the kind of soldier who followed orders without question. At 28, she had already served 3 tours overseas and earned the respect of her unit through unwavering dedication and tactical brilliance. Her dark hair was always perfectly regulation, her uniform crisp, and her demeanor professional. She had grown up in a military family in Texas, where honor and duty weren't just words, they were a way of life. The trouble began on a humid Tuesday morning at Forward Operating Base Kaleidoscope in eastern Afghanistan. Rebecca was leading a routine patrol with her squad when they received an urgent radio transmission from command. Intelligence had located a high-value target in a nearby village, a Taliban commander responsible for several recent attacks on coalition forces. The mission was supposed to be straightforward: secure the target and extract him for questioning. Rebecca's squad consisted of 5 soldiers she had trained with for months. There was Corporal James Thompson, a young man from Ohio who never missed a shot; Private First Class Maria Santos, a communications specialist from California; Specialist David Kim, their medic from New York; and Private Michael Rodriguez, the newest member from Florida. They had become like family, watching each other's backs through countless dangerous missions. As they approached the village, something felt wrong. Rebecca had developed an instinct for danger over her years of service, and every fiber of her being was screaming that this was a trap. The village was too quiet, too empty. Birds weren't chirping, dogs weren't barking, and the usual sounds of daily life were completely absent. She tried to radio her concerns back to base, but command insisted they proceed with the mission. The trap was sprung the moment they entered the village center. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions, and Rebecca watched in horror as her squad was systematically surrounded. They fought bravely, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. In the chaos, she saw Thompson fall, clutching his shoulder. Santos was pinned behind a crumbling wall, her radio equipment destroyed. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Rebecca made a split-second decision that would haunt her for months. Instead of fighting to the death, she ordered her team to surrender. It was the hardest command she had ever given, but she knew it was their only chance of survival. As Taliban fighters closed in, she dropped her weapon and raised her hands, watching as her soldiers did the same. The look of confusion and betrayal in their eyes cut deeper than any bullet could. The capture was swift and brutal. They were blindfolded, bound, and loaded into vehicles before being transported to an unknown location. Rebecca spent the journey trying to memorize every turn, every sound, every smell that might help her later. She had to believe there would be a later. Major William Harrison, the commanding officer back at base, was furious when he received word of the capture. He had never liked Rebecca, considering her too soft for leadership despite her exemplary record. In his mind, a real soldier would have fought to the death rather than surrender. He immediately began spreading rumors that Rebecca had deliberately led her squad into an ambush, suggesting she might be a traitor or collaborator. Staff Sergeant Rebecca Martinez had always been the kind of soldier who followed orders without question. At 28, she had already served 3 tours overseas and earned the respect of her unit through unwavering dedication and tactical brilliance. Her dark hair was always perfectly regulation, her uniform crisp, and her demeanor professional. She had grown up in a military family in Texas, where honor and duty weren't just words, they were a way of life. The trouble began on a humid Tuesday morning at Forward Operating Base Kaleidoscope in eastern Afghanistan. Rebecca was leading a routine patrol with her squad when they received an urgent radio transmission from command. Intelligence had located a high-value target in a nearby village, a Taliban commander responsible for several recent attacks on coalition forces. The mission was supposed to be straightforward: secure the target and extract him for questioning. Rebecca's squad consisted of 5 soldiers she had trained with for months. There was Corporal James Thompson, a young man from Ohio who never missed a shot; Private First Class Maria Santos, a communications specialist from California; Specialist David Kim, their medic from New York; and Private Michael Rodriguez, the newest member from Florida. They had become like family, watching each other's backs through countless dangerous missions. As they approached the village, something felt wrong. Rebecca had developed an instinct for danger over her years of service, and every fiber of her being was screaming that this was a trap. The village was too quiet, too empty. Birds weren't chirping, dogs weren't barking, and the usual sounds of daily life were completely absent. She tried to radio her concerns back to base, but command insisted they proceed with the mission. The trap was sprung the moment they entered the village center. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions, and Rebecca watched in horror as her squad was systematically surrounded. They fought bravely, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. In the chaos, she saw Thompson fall, clutching his shoulder. Santos was pinned behind a crumbling wall, her radio equipment destroyed. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Rebecca made a split-second decision that would haunt her for months. Instead of fighting to the death, she ordered her team to surrender. It was the hardest command she had ever given, but she knew it was their only chance of survival. As Taliban fighters closed in, she dropped her weapon and raised her hands, watching as her soldiers did the same. The look of confusion and betrayal in their eyes cut deeper than any bullet could. The capture was swift and brutal. They were blindfolded, bound, and loaded into vehicles before being transported to an unknown location. Rebecca spent the journey trying to memorize every turn, every sound, every smell that might help her later. She had to believe there would be a later. Major William Harrison, the commanding officer back at base, was furious when he received word of the capture. He had never liked Rebecca, considering her too soft for leadership despite her exemplary record. In his mind, a real soldier would have fought to the death rather than surrender. He immediately began spreading rumors that Rebecca had deliberately led her squad into an ambush, suggesting she might be a traitor or collaborator. The holding facility was a converted warehouse in the mountains, cold and damp with concrete floors that seemed to radiate chill into their bones. Rebecca and her team were separated immediately, each placed in individual cells that were barely large enough to lie down in. The psychological torture began immediately. Loud music played at random hours, lights flickered on and off without pattern, and meals were delivered sporadically to break their sense of time. For the first week, Rebecca focused on keeping her team's morale up. She developed a tapping code on the walls to communicate with the others, letting them know she was still alive and still fighting. Thompson's shoulder wound was getting worse without proper medical attention, and she could hear him struggling through the thin walls. Santos was holding up better, using her technical knowledge to try to figure out their location based on radio frequencies she could occasionally pick up. The interrogations were brutal but predictable. Rebecca's captors wanted information about troop movements, base locations, and operational plans. She gave them nothing but her name, rank, and serial number, exactly as she had been trained. Each session ended with threats about what would happen to her soldiers if she didn't cooperate, but she knew that giving up information would only make things worse for everyone. Meanwhile, back at the base, Major Harrison was painting a very different picture of the situation. He told anyone who would listen that Rebecca had probably turned, that her surrender was suspicious, and that she might be feeding information to the enemy. He conveniently ignored the fact that no new attacks had occurred since their capture, which would have been expected if she had actually been providing intelligence. The truth was that Harrison had political ambitions beyond his military career. He was looking for a scapegoat for the failed mission, and Rebecca made a perfect target. Her success as a female leader in a male-dominated field had always bothered him, and this situation gave him the perfect opportunity to destroy her reputation. He began filing reports that painted her as unreliable and possibly traitorous, knowing that these would follow her for the rest of her career. By the second week of captivity, Rebecca had formulated a plan. She had been studying her guards' routines, nodding when they were most and least alert, and mapping the layout of the facility in her mind. She knew that escape would be nearly impossible, but she also knew that rescue was unlikely given the remote location, and the fact that command didn't even know where they were being held. The breakthrough came when she overheard two guards discussing the arrival of new prisoners, captured Taliban fighters who were being brought to the same facility. This was the opportunity she had been waiting for. If she could somehow turn the tables and capture these high-value targets, she might be able to prove her loyalty and secure her team's freedom. Rebecca began working on a plan that would require perfect timing, incredible luck, and the kind of tactical brilliance that had made her a successful squad leader. She would need to coordinate with her team, overcome their guards, and somehow manage to not only escape, but also secure enemy prisoners in the process. It seemed impossible, but she had learned long ago that impossible was just another word for challenging. The new prisoners arrived on a rainy Thursday night, their vehicle convoy struggling through the muddy mountain roads. Rebecca could hear the commotion from her cell as the guards prepared additional holding areas. She used her tapping code to alert her team that something was about to happen, though she couldn't risk explaining the full plan through the walls. She would need their trust and their training to kick in when the moment came. As she lay in her cell that night, Rebecca thought about her family back in Texas. Her father, a retired Army colonel, had always taught her that honor wasn't about never falling down. It was about getting back up no matter how many times you were knocked down. Her mother, a strong woman who had raised 3 children while her husband was deployed, had instilled in her the belief that there was always a way forward, even when the path seemed impossible to find. The facility held 12 Taliban prisoners by the end of the week, including several high-ranking commanders that coalition forces had been hunting for months. Rebecca realized that if she could somehow turn the tables and deliver these prisoners to coalition forces, it would not only prove her loyalty, but also strike a major blow against enemy operations in the region. The audacity of the plan was staggering, but she had learned that sometimes the most impossible plans were the ones that actually worked. She spent the next several days gathering intelligence on the new arrivals, listening to conversations between guards, and building a mental map of where everyone was being held. The facility was becoming crowded, and she sensed that the guards were becoming complacent. They had been holding American prisoners for weeks without any rescue attempts, and their vigilance was beginning to wane. Rebecca knew that her window of opportunity was closing fast. Intelligence suggested that the Taliban prisoners would be moved to a more secure location within days, and her own team was beginning to show signs of serious physical and psychological deterioration. Thompson's shoulder wound was infected, Santos was developing a persistent cough, and Rodriguez seemed to be losing hope entirely. If she was going to act, it had to be soon. The plan she developed was complex and required split-second timing. She would need to overpower her guards simultaneously with her team's efforts, secure weapons, and then systematically capture the Taliban prisoners before they could be moved or before reinforcements could arrive. It would require her team to function as a cohesive unit despite weeks of captivity and torture, and it would require her to make tactical decisions in real time without the benefit of proper reconnaissance or backup. On the night she chose to execute her plan, Rebecca felt the familiar calm that always preceded combat. She had felt this same sensation before her first firefight, before her first leadership test, and before every major challenge of her military career. It was the feeling of knowing that everything she had trained for, everything she had learned, was about to be put to the ultimate test. She began by creating a distraction during the evening meal distribution. Using techniques she had learned in survival training, she made herself appear to be having a medical emergency, causing the guards to open her cell and cluster around her. In that moment of confusion, she struck with precision and speed, disarming one guard and using his weapon to neutralize the others before they could raise an alarm. The hardest part of the plan was the coordination required with her team. Using the tapping code, she had prepared them for a simultaneous breakout, but executing it required perfect timing and flawless execution. One by one, she moved through the facility, releasing her soldiers and arming them with weapons taken from the guards. Thompson, despite his injury, proved that his marksmanship skills were still sharp. Santos immediately began working on communications equipment to contact base. Kim started treating wounded prisoners to prevent deaths that might complicate their situation later. The Taliban prisoners were housed in a separate wing of the facility, and securing them required a different approach entirely. These were hardened fighters who would not hesitate to kill American soldiers given the opportunity. Rebecca had to balance the need to treat them humanely with the requirement to keep them secure and prevent them from becoming a threat to her team. The operation took 6 hours to complete, during which Rebecca and her team systematically secured the entire facility, captured 12 high-value Taliban prisoners, and established communication with coalition forces. When the rescue helicopters finally arrived at dawn, they found Rebecca and her team in complete control of the situation, with enemy prisoners properly secured and ready for transport. The rescue was everything Rebecca had hoped for and more. As the helicopters touched down in the mountain clearing, she felt a surge of pride and relief that she had not experienced since the beginning of this ordeal. Her team had performed flawlessly, despite weeks of captivity and torture. They had not only survived, but had turned their captivity into a major victory for coalition forces. The flight back to base was surreal after so many weeks in captivity. Rebecca watched the mountains pass beneath them and tried to process everything that had happened. She had been labeled a traitor, had endured torture and psychological manipulation, and had planned and executed one of the most audacious military operations of her career. But she knew that the real challenge was just beginning. Major Harrison was waiting at the landing zone when the helicopters arrived, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. He had spent weeks building a narrative around Rebecca's supposed betrayal, and her return with high-value prisoners completely undermined everything he had been saying. The other officers present were clearly confused by the disconnect between Harrison's reports and the reality of what had just transpired. Rebecca's first instinct was to report immediately to her commanding officer, but she was quickly whisked away to a medical facility for evaluation and debriefing. The Army needed to understand exactly what had happened during their captivity, how they had managed to escape, and what intelligence they might have gathered about enemy operations. The debriefing process would take days, but Rebecca was eager to tell her story and clear her name. The medical evaluation revealed the extent of the physical and psychological trauma that Rebecca and her team had endured. Thompson's shoulder wound required immediate surgery, and all of them showed signs of malnutrition and stress. But the doctors were amazed by their overall condition, particularly given the circumstances of their captivity and the fact that they had been able to execute such a complex operation. During the initial debriefing sessions, Rebecca learned about the rumors that had been circulating about her supposed betrayal. She was shocked to discover that Major Harrison had been actively undermining her reputation while she was being held prisoner. The investigators seemed skeptical of Harrison's claims, particularly in light of the successful prisoner capture. But Rebecca knew that reputations were fragile things in the military. The Taliban prisoners that Rebecca had captured proved to be an intelligence goldmine. Several of them were high-ranking commanders who had been planning major attacks on coalition forces. The information gathered from their interrogations led to the disruption of multiple enemy operations and saved countless lives. Rebecca's decision to capture rather than kill these prisoners had yielded far more valuable results than anyone had expected. Word of Rebecca's heroic actions began to spread throughout the military community, but she knew that Major Harrison would not give up his campaign against her easily. He had too much invested in his version of events to simply admit that he had been wrong. Rebecca prepared herself for a long battle to clear her name and restore her reputation. The formal investigation into the incident began 3 weeks after Rebecca's return. Army investigators interviewed everyone involved in the original mission, reviewed radio communications, and examined the intelligence that had led to the failed patrol. What they discovered was that the mission had been poorly planned from the beginning, with inadequate intelligence and insufficient support. Rebecca's decision to surrender had likely saved her team's lives. Major Harrison's version of events began to crumble under scrutiny. His claims that Rebecca had deliberately led her team into an ambush were contradicted by radio transcripts that showed her expressing concerns about the mission before it began. His suggestions that she had been cooperating with the enemy were undermined by the fact that she had captured 12 high-value prisoners and provided valuable intelligence to coalition forces. The investigation also revealed that Harrison had been filing false reports about Rebecca's performance and reliability. Several other officers came forward to testify that Harrison had been actively trying to undermine Rebecca's career for months, apparently motivated by personal animosity rather than genuine concerns about her competence. The picture that emerged was of a vindictive superior officer who had used a crisis situation to pursue a personal vendetta. Rebecca's team members provided crucial testimony about her leadership during their captivity. They described how she had maintained morale, coordinated their resistance efforts, and ultimately planned and executed their escape. Their accounts painted a picture of a leader who had gone above and beyond to protect her soldiers and serve her country under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. The turning point in the investigation came when intelligence analysts revealed that the Taliban prisoners Rebecca had captured were providing information about a major planned attack on coalition forces. The intelligence was so valuable that it had already prevented multiple casualties and disrupted enemy operations throughout the region. Rebecca's actions had not only saved her own team, but had also contributed significantly to the broader war effort. As the investigation continued, Rebecca tried to focus on her recovery and the recovery of her team. Thompson's shoulder was healing well, and he was expected to make a full recovery. Santos had developed expertise in communications intelligence that made her invaluable to future operations. Kim's medical skills had been enhanced by his experience treating wounded prisoners under difficult circumstances. Rodriguez, despite his youth, had shown remarkable resilience and was developing into a skilled soldier. The preliminary findings of the investigation were released 6 weeks after Rebecca's return, and they completely vindicated her actions. The report concluded that she had shown exceptional leadership under extreme circumstances, had made difficult decisions that saved lives, and had ultimately turned a potential disaster into a significant victory for coalition forces. The report recommended that she be considered for commendation rather than disciplinary action. Major Harrison's reaction to the preliminary findings was predictable. He accused the investigators of bias, claimed that the evidence had been manipulated, and suggested that Rebecca had somehow influenced the testimony of her team members. His increasingly desperate attempts to maintain his version of events only served to further undermine his credibility and raise questions about his fitness for command. The final report was released 3 months after Rebecca's return, and it was even more favorable than the preliminary findings. The investigators concluded that Rebecca had displayed exceptional courage, leadership, and tactical brilliance throughout the ordeal. They recommended that she be promoted and considered for one of the military's highest honors. The report also recommended that Major Harrison be investigated for filing false reports and abusing his authority. Rebecca's vindication was complete, but she knew that the damage to her reputation would take time to fully repair. Military communities were small, and rumors traveled fast. She would need to prove herself all over again, but she was confident that her actions spoke louder than any words or false reports. She had done her duty under the most difficult circumstances imaginable, and she had brought her team home safely. The awards ceremony took place 6 months after Rebecca's return, in front of an audience that included her family, her team, and senior military officials from throughout the region. She received the Silver Star for her actions during the escape and prisoner capture, and her team members received Bronze Stars for their roles in the operation. It was a moment of triumph that made all the hardships and accusations worthwhile. Major Harrison was notably absent from the ceremony. He had been quietly transferred to a desk job, pending a full investigation into his conduct. The Army had decided that his behavior during the crisis had been inappropriate and potentially damaging to military operations. His career prospects had been severely damaged, while Rebecca's star was clearly on the rise. In her acceptance speech, Rebecca spoke about the importance of never giving up, even when the situation seemed hopeless. She talked about the strength that comes from working as a team and the courage required to make difficult decisions under pressure. She thanked her family, her team, and the Army for supporting her through the most challenging period of her life. The story of Rebecca's heroic actions became legendary within military circles, a testament to the power of leadership, courage, and determination. She had proven that even in the darkest circumstances, it was possible to turn defeat into victory and to emerge stronger than before. Her example inspired a new generation of military leaders and showed that true heroism often comes from the most unexpected places. Rebecca continued to serve with distinction for many years after the incident, eventually rising to the rank of colonel and commanding her own unit. She never forgot the lessons learned during those dark weeks of captivity, and she used her experience to train and mentor other soldiers facing their own challenges. Her story became a reminder that labels and accusations are temporary, but actions and character are permanent. The Taliban prisoners that Rebecca captured continued to provide valuable intelligence for years after their capture. Several major terrorist attacks were prevented based on information they provided, and numerous enemy operatives were captured or killed. Rebecca's decision to capture rather than kill these prisoners had yielded intelligence benefits that far exceeded anyone's expectations at the time. Years later, when Rebecca looked back on the incident, she realized that it had been a defining moment in her life and career. She had been tested in ways that she never could have imagined, and she had emerged stronger and more confident in her abilities. The experience had taught her that reputation and truth were not always the same thing, but that truth had a way of emerging if you were patient and persistent enough. The bond between Rebecca and her team members remained strong for the rest of their careers. They had shared an experience that few people could understand, and they had proven to themselves and others that they were capable of extraordinary things when working together. Their story became a testament to the power of teamwork, leadership, and the human spirit's ability to overcome even the most difficult challenges. Rebecca's father, the retired Army colonel, was perhaps the proudest of anyone when he heard about his daughter's actions. He had always believed that she had the potential to be a great leader, and her performance during the crisis had exceeded even his highest expectations. He told everyone who would listen that his daughter had proven that honor and courage were not just words, but principles that could guide people through their darkest hours. The facility where Rebecca and her team had been held was eventually destroyed by coalition forces, but not before intelligence teams had thoroughly examined it and gathered valuable information about enemy operations. The successful rescue and prisoner capture had also provided important lessons about survival, escape, and evasion techniques that were incorporated into military training programs. Rebecca's story spread beyond military circles and became an inspiration to people in all walks of life. She received letters from students, business professionals, and others who had read about her experience and been inspired by her refusal to give up in the face of seemingly impossible odds. Her story became a reminder that leadership is not about position or authority, but about character and the willingness to do what is right regardless of personal cost. The investigation into Major Harrison's conduct continued for several months after Rebecca's vindication. The Army discovered that he had a pattern of targeting subordinates who he perceived as threats to his authority, and that his behavior toward Rebecca was part of a broader pattern of abusive conduct. He was eventually forced to retire from the military, his career effectively ended by his own actions. Rebecca never sought revenge against Major Harrison, despite the damage he had tried to do to her reputation and career. She believed that his own actions had been punishment enough, and she preferred to focus on moving forward rather than dwelling on past grievances. Her magnanimous response to his attacks only served to further enhance her reputation as a leader of exceptional character. The lessons learned from Rebecca's experience were incorporated into military leadership training programs around the world. Her story became a case study in crisis leadership, demonstrating how effective leaders can turn even the most dire circumstances into opportunities for success. Military academies began teaching courses based on her experience, and her tactics became standard procedures for escape and evasion scenarios. Rebecca's final promotion to colonel came with an assignment to train the next generation of military leaders. She found great satisfaction in sharing her knowledge and experience with young officers who were just beginning their careers. She always told them that the most important lesson she had learned was that true leadership meant taking responsibility for your team's welfare, even when it came at personal cost. The story of Staff Sergeant Rebecca Martinez, who was labeled a traitor but returned with prisoners, became more than just a military tale. It became a story about the power of perseverance, the importance of character, and the way that truth ultimately prevails over falsehood. Her legacy continues to inspire new generations of leaders who face their own challenges and need reminders that courage and determination can overcome even the most difficult circumstances. In the end, Rebecca's story proved that heroes are not born but made through the choices they make in their darkest moments. When faced with impossible odds, she chose to fight rather than surrender, to lead rather than follow, and to trust in her principles rather than compromise them for temporary advantage. Her example continues to inspire people around the world who face their own battles against injustice, betrayal, and seemingly insurmountable odds.